Aloha and welcome to Coffee Without Milk, a podcast presented by Maui Institute for Modern Music and Ebb and Flow Arts. More information about upcoming concerts, events, and educational opportunities can be found at www.ebbandflowarts.org. Good afternoon, morning, evening, good day to you all. Welcome to Coffee Without Milk, the Ebb and Flow Arts podcast. Today we have a whole variety of special guests. Most importantly, Andy Behrle. And Andy Behrle, maybe you can help us welcome the professor and Loli to get this show started.
What do you have for us this lovely morning, Professor and Loli?
Good morning. Welcome to the podcast. I'm Loli the Frog, and one of the reasons we're here is to say that except for this kind of silliness that we do, yes, it's rather silly, isn't it, Loli? We are part of the education program, or certainly we used to be, when we went into the public schools. Yes, we hope to maybe do it again sometime, Loli. And what we would do is mainly teach music lessons, just the two of us and then some other characters. But eventually, it seemed like we were the most effective teachers from any of the others that are in the program, with all due respect, because Peter was involved and et cetera. But yes, Loli, but let's get on with it, okay? All right. Well, the thing is that we call this Coffee Without Milk, indeed. And that's because we have a joke, from an interesting article that said, a man walks into a restaurant. Yes, suppose it's you. Okay. Waiter, I would like some coffee, but without cream, please. Oh, sorry, but we don't have cream. However, we have milk. Would you prefer coffee without milk? Very funny. Don't be a wise guy, waiter. And please bring me the coffee. And I believe, Peter, you may have your coffee. But
I always have my coffee.
Yes. But, well, the point is, of course, that we're living a staying home and we can't do things that we maybe wouldn't want to do anyway, but at least we'd have the option to do them. We can't do them. So it's a kind of frustrating situation. Yes, but we like to be at home, don't we, Loli? We're not particularly social, are we? No. Yeah, one of my friends' cousin, Harry, said that, he prefers to be home, and it's a good excuse for him not to be social. Very funny. Well, anyway, we have a wonderful guest, and we've been researching him, haven't we, Loli? Yes. Amazing work from Andy Behrle. So let's get on with it, shall we, Peter? Thank you. Goodbye.
All right. Thank you to you, fine gentlemen. So Andy, welcome to the show. It's a lot of fun to have you here, but also most especially, I wanted to tell a brief story about how I came to know your work. So I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and when I was in high school, one of my music teachers in high school somehow got me involved or in touch with folks over at Jack Straw. And, this is like the early 2000s. And I don't think I did any work for them. I might have attended an exhibit, and I think they had like an acoustic soundscape environmental kind of a installation there. And somehow I got on their mailing list like 20 years ago. So I checked through a recent email and I was exploring their site and I ran across your name and I liked the title of your work, Luminous Landscapes. Is that what it's called?
Luminous Soundscape.
Luminous Soundscapes. I knew I didn't quite have it right. And I listened to your podcast about it and I thought, well, that's really interesting. I can really resonate with some of this philosophy, some of this design, and checked you out a little bit more, and I realized I'd actually already seen some of your work exhibited in Wailuku on Maui last fall. And I had no idea at that time what I was about to get into. And then from there on, it was a massive exploration of all the things you've done. And I got really excited by your work for a lot of reasons. So where should we start? Should we start with Jack Straw? Should we start with your experience with water and light? Your philosophy of shape.
I think Jack Straw is a good place to start. It kind of is a convergence of different aspects of work and different bodies of work that I've been creating over the last decade or so. Yeah, we can start with that.
Great.
So I can go ahead, I can describe it a little bit and then maybe pull up a video and kind of show people what it looked like.
Yeah, let's kind of back up. How did you first get involved and get the work commissioned for that installation and run us through that whole process?
Sure. Every year they have an open call for artist submissions for proposals for site-specific projects for their new media gallery, which is on site at their recording studios. They're mostly a recording studio and post-production type place. They also have this visual arts component and a small gallery that they have for experimental projects. And to fill out their schedule, they have an open call every year for artists around, I think it's open to nationwide, but it's mostly filled with regional Northwestern artists. And at the time I was living in Yakima, Washington, and came up with this proposal. I'd been working on this body of work that explored what sound might look like if we could see it, and using different technologies and different methods to try and translate sound into a visual experience. And I didn't know very much about recording sound or dealing with sound. I hadn't done very much of it. So I thought that they would be a great resource for me to try and make a giant leap into field recordings and try and translate those field recordings into a visual experience. And that's kind of how it started. I wrote a proposal that they were kind enough to bite on. And then that started about a year-long process of learning how to use field recording equipment and how to edit footage, and then work with some computer programming to create little devices that would then take the sound signals and translate them into physical vibrations for these devices that I made. That those devices would shimmer around in some water, and then I create these light projectors similar to overhead projectors, the old overhead projectors from the classrooms of yonder year, and fill space with that vibration and shadow play of the water moving, and it all being activated by these sounds, by these recorded sounds.
So basically what you're describing is a process of synesthesia, where you have some sort of a transduction medium, which is the light and the water interacting with the sound. But you, not being a sound guy, you decided to build the devices first, or how did you conceive of the entire presentation?
Yeah, it kind of built upon a project where I had been creating these overhead projector style light projectors that were filtering light through moving water. And then I was activating the water in different ways with pumps, with dripping water and all these little devices. And somewhere along the line, it just got stuck in my head of, what if I could see sound? I think that it might look a little something like this. It might look like all of these rippling shadows in water. If I could fill space with that, maybe that's what sound would look like, and the sound of a space would look like if I could see it, or what the Wi-Fi signal bouncing around the room would look like if only I could experience it with my eyes.
5Gs.
Yeah, right. Stop giving me a headache.
I know. Mind control. No, that's fantastic.
And so, yeah, and that just sparked this idea of, what if this was sound, and how could I translate sound into this? And so I just started playing around with putting some speakers, making speakers submergible into water and seeing what it did. And that resulted in a series of works that I did, projecting onto inflated weather balloons and watching the textures of radio stations shimmer around on these weather balloons. And from there I was like, well, where else can this go? What else can I do with this? Can I do something with some recorded sounds? And then I walking around in Seattle one afternoon, I just was kind of pondering all of this sound, all these waves of information that are cascading through the streets, and wondering what would all that look like? What would all that chaos look like? And how could I translate that into a physical experience? And And from there, just kind of started to dive into some microprocessor type little computer things and kind of self-learning how to go about using Raspberry Pis and Arduinos and all these weird little programmable devices to do some of these things, and go from digital signals to analog signals in the water, and trying to think about how that all might inform how we experience the world around us.
It's amazing because it seems to me like you are primarily, in a sense, a visual artist and a sculptor. And so by going down this road, you basically had to expose yourself to about 60 to 100 years of audio technology real rapidly, and find a way to incorporate that with meaning into your work. You may not realize, but there was a lot of work going on in the late 40s and early 50s that was in some raw form, sort of like this, where composers would go out with some type of a field recorder, and they would make recordings of things in their everyday life, and they would compose these acoustic landscapes based on these recordings. And so in France, they called that musique concrète, and it was recordings of real objects that would be, transfigured or changed somehow or modulated to be almost unrecognizable. And so that was the raw basis of that musical material. And in some sort of ways, it's like you stumbled upon this whole amazing field of work that's been going on, but in that same way, you've found a way to make it a unique expression that is a component of your sculpture work too. Fascinating.
Yeah, and
stuff.
so a lot of that has spawned a body of work that I call my sound sculptures, which do use sort of old technologies and new technologies together to imagine what light might sound like, or what sound might look like, and I have kind of gone back in time to transform old mid-century record players into music boxes, and think about the translation of information from pins coming out of a music box player and striking tines, and what's the information that's informing it? Is it a musical composition, or is it a star chart, or some other form of information, and try to reimagine how we experience the information that we think we know with a different sense.
Peter, what strikes me about Andy's work is that there are certain perhaps parallels to some of our projects. For example, at one point in checking out your videos, Andy, you say you want to see sound and listen to light.
Yeah.
And we've had a project over the years, now somewhat dormant because the initiator or originator of it has passed away, Emil Richards, but he created a piece for us called The Eyes Hear, the Ears See. And it was mainly a painting, in real-time painting to live music, a concept of that kind, but it has very, very similar, for me, very similar impetus to your work as well. And yeah, it's as Peter mentioned, synesthetic, including perhaps smell, which we've incorporated from time to time. Not body odor, but
could be lately. We're all
not purposefully, at least.
What did we do that? Oh yeah, we had tuberose flowers for people. We were showing a film about flowers, and people could carry in the tuberoses and get the waft of those. But yeah, so it's also what struck me is the one piece entitled, maybe you have some material from that, the Aurora Aquatic Corona. So that's like a bullseye for us, because we're trying to put together a collection of work in the time of Corona. And last week we hit upon the fact that the pianist Adam Tendler has recorded a piece by Toru Takemitsu, the Japanese composer, entitled Corona. He wrote it in the 60s, so nothing to do with that today, but wondered about that piece in particular. But in any case, go on. The only other comment that
we could make at this point, Peter, is our Music of the Spheres project in the Planetarium, where it strikes me, for example, that Andy's hydrodome concept could work. And we've already discussed this, Andy. We have a new opening, possibly. Now it's all kind of
in the limbo of the corona, as it were.
It is the limbo of the corona.
Yeah. And
all we know is right now.
Yeah.
We barely know that.
Right. The Maui Ocean Center has a new state-of-the-art 3D planetarium. Have you run across it?
Oh yeah, I've enjoyed the show about probably a dozen times.
Oh really?
Wow.
Great.
We have a now 6-year-old, and so we spent maybe every couple of weeks a trip over to the Ocean Center, and when I could convince him that it wasn't going to be scary when the whales come flying out of the water at the end, that he would go in with me.
Yeah, it's very loud too, so that would that frightened
kind of
me
an
a little
overwhelming
bit.
experience, especially for little ones.
Yeah,
can be scary. When the whale approaches you to the point you could reach out and touch its eye and all of that. It's
amazing.
Pretty amazing. So anyway, this is do you happen to know when the Maui Ocean Center is reopening, or you're now aware
anything about it?
Yeah, I haven't heard if they are planning it yet.
Yeah, but we discussed it, and it struck me that if we could somehow arrange it, and this was a major production for us, but to set up your hydrodome within the dome, so yours on the floor while on the screen, the dome itself are projected images derived from maybe the hydrodome or other images. Similar planet, the project that where you have, purposely made planet-like objects.
So maybe to fill in the audience a little bit. I had talked a bit about projecting onto inflated weather balloons with these light and water devices. Well, that naturally, for me, I followed the work in this direction of texture of water and being bent by the architecture and the 3 dimensions of the weather balloon, and started to use digital video footage to do that, and capturing digital video footage from around the world and then transferring that to the surface of these weather balloons, transforming them into these little planetoids. As you see the water rushing through a river from left to right, it makes the sphere look like it's rotating on its axis. And from there, I was just drawn to what would it look like if I was standing inside of that balloon. And so what I had to do to create that was build a geodesic dome that I could project upon from the outside, and then the viewers could be huddled together on the inside, or a solo experience on the inside, and be just totally immersed in these kind of dry, fluid worlds. And I've since then dreamt of using a planetarium dome or something like the dome at the Ocean Center as a way to continue playing around with some of those ideas. Yeah.
Okay. So, and then, we'll have to pursue this to the extent we're able. And Peter, though, you felt it wasn't necessarily the greatest idea to construct a smaller sphere, so to speak, within the larger sphere.
Oh, you mean a dome within a dome? I mean, I guess my point of view about that would be, would we have to move the seating around and if there's enough space in there? But also because the audience, is naturally kind of tilted back, looking upwards toward the dome.
Right.
So they might think they're missing something if there's something at their feet that they're not able to look at all the time. But I like the idea of a
different perspective there.
Right, but an installation that could last some time would be really amazing, even in the sort of the waiting room lobby or something. I wonder, are there any dome environments that you're aware of, Andy, in Colorado? Because if we can put a show together this year, we may want to look outside of Hawaii for some other
I'm not sure. We're here visiting my my in-laws currently. We're left Maui. Well, I guess 3 or 4 weeks ago now. To hunker down here on the family farm they have 80 acres here and a couple houses, and one of them is empty. So we came and just got over our quarantine from them, and now we get to all hang out together and feel safe. And my wife is in healthcare, and so we're concerned when she goes back, and she's in between jobs right now, and she'll start a new assignment in July. And when that happens, depending on what all is happening with the virus, we may not be able to visit with grandparents for quite a while. So we were looking at this as an opportunity, a block of time to be able to make sure that we got some good quality time with the grandparents for our kids. And
man, I'm glad you're taking advantage of that then. Yeah, in times like this, you realize how important that is to try to carve out as much time as possible to stay connected with family. Me being out here in Hawaii and my family being elsewhere predominantly, this particular time in my life has made me realize, wow, it's not just thousands of miles, but it's thousands of miles. And now this pandemic that separates us. And it's hard to wrap my mind around.
Oh no. And when we were moving to Hawaii, it was like, oh, it's so simple for grandparents, for family to come and visit us. And maybe even just as simple as the very rural part of Washington state that we were living in. Like I have my family all lives in the Northeast, in the Boston and New York area. And it was like, well, getting all the way to rural Washington takes all day. And then
it would be harder to get to rural Washington, I think, actually, than Hawaii.
Which is nice, but it's so it's a very special experience for them to be able to go all the way to Hawaii and spend time with their grandkids. And it's like, oh, well, this is pretty easy. And then as we saw the airline stop flying to and from Maui, it was like, well, there were 4 flights coming and leaving the continent every hour, and now it's 4 a week. And so we really felt like this that's all collapsing in on us. Where how no one can get to us, we can't get to anybody. How does
the island fever is real? I know, sure.
Well, yeah, I know, and I never had really felt it at all, and then just kind of felt like, oh yeah, we're really in the middle of the Pacific Ocean in a way that we weren't before, and this is what it must have felt like when you had a boat there, right? And
and I think that a lot of people and even myself, I love it at times, this insane type of isolation, but then sometimes I'm like, but if I just had to get out, how would I do that at this point? I usually fly Hawaiian Airlines, and they're not even flying to Seattle right now, so it just blows my mind. Before we get too deep into, our discussion of modern times, can we go back to some of the works we talked about? I wanted to,
sure.
I really feel like we're not quite done talking about projected light and sound.
Yeah.
And if we can kind of wrap up a few of the ideas you're talking about with some video and images, would you be comfortable kind of sharing some of the work that we've talked about?
Where would you like to start?
Let's start at the Hydrodome and then work our way kind of backwards through some of the things we talked about.
I'm going to go ahead and start to share my screen and pull some stuff out here.
Now, what I like a lot about the Hydrodome is the construction of it. I mean, it's very solid. How did you start to, you're obviously very, very crafty in terms of your ability to work with wood and construct things. I've seen a lot of your work. How did you begin working with the concept for the Hydrodome, deciding its size and developing the materials you would use to create those joints? I mean, that's
it was a process. I really liked the idea of using these buckyballs, these Buckminster Fuller.
I was wondering. I'm sure it was a Buckminster Fuller thing. I was like, it looks like a Epcot Center.
And then it's this dated futurism, right? And how that informs changing how we experience the natural world. I guess to boil down the process of how it ended up being built, I used a very simple lumber from the lumberyard, 2x3 pine that would be used for framing in a house, and some plywood to create these hubs that you can see. You're able to see my mouse kind of trace things. And then just each triangle here ends up bolting together, and then it's all stretched with a boat wrap material, a translucent boat wrap material, or something that would be used for a greenhouse, and kind of shrink wrapped in plastic.
How tight that looks like a difficult material to work with. So you probably had to get a few different technicians up on ladders to stretch and pull and set that material.
Yeah, this was the first time that it was put together in its entirety. It had been kind of shown in sections in smaller spaces, but the University of Idaho was able to help fund putting the whole 3/5 of a sphere up here in one of their galleries. And they were able to give me some student support to help me put it together. It took about 5 days from start to finish to construct the dome and stretch that material in place. I think eventually it would be nice to get away from the plastic and get to a reusable fabric that was sewn for each panel. But learning sort of how the fabric of the plastic stretched and needed to fit the dome really is going to help inform how it might be sewn one day.
I could imagine maybe like a semi-opaque kind of silk might also do the job.
Yeah, I had originally intended to make these kind of stretched triangular panels that would slip in to the framework after it had been put together. The frame itself goes together in just a few hours, maybe like 4 or 5 hours of just bolting each piece together and getting it all together. And then when it's all said and done, I can hang, 2 of us could hang from the center of it and not stretch or move the dome at all. It's so structurally sound.
Wow. Well, shout out to Buckminster Fuller.
Right? Do it. So here you'll see that it was one set of footage or a single video file that ended up being projected from the left and the right of the dome, mirrored to one another. And so then they stretch and fold into one another sort of on the edges. So, there's this big draw to digitally video map to different segments and different walls, and as they come across and making sure everything looks like it's coming from maybe multiple video projectors to make everything look so super tight and clean. And I was, with a lot of this work, I was much more interested in seeing how dimension changes the image instead of trying to change the image to fit the dimensions, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I think it leaves a bit more to indeterminacy and chance, because you can just kind of project it towards it, and I think it is more reflective of a natural environment as opposed to something that is over-managed and over-controlled. And especially the technology is more in the construction as opposed to all the different types of interactive video processes. The sculpture isn't a bunch of interactive video processes. The sculpture is that this thing exists and can be experienced inside and out.
Yeah. And it's all these little like timeless microcosms from all these various places where you go, oh, well, that's this section of the Columbia River that we're looking at right there, or here's sunset over a lake. They're timeless, but always unique, and then taking these little tiny moments of time and stretching them in a loop for virtual eternity is a interesting way for me to think about memory and the movement of time, and to try and think of things as not being maybe quite as linear as we're used to.
Yeah. How appropriate for times like this.
I know, right?
You have footage of the Hydrodome.
Oh yeah, why don't you play back some of that footage, Andy? I wanted to check that out.
There it is.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to see.
Okay.
And you could talk about it a little bit too as we're watching it.
Yeah. So we're looking from, say, the left side of the entrance here. This one open section is where you would enter into it, but also experience it from the outside, like here.
Mm-hmm.
I have a stunning silhouette. It's really my best side.
It is kind of a portrait,
you
isn't
can
it?
see how the footage is then stretching and fading as it brings itself to the far edges of the dome from whatever side it's projecting from. In this space, there was a column that was right through the middle of the gallery, and so I decided to build it around the column. That's what you saw there.
It is amazing how a column will be used in a space like that too. I've on Maui, we make do with what we have a lot of the time, and there's a couple of theaters that actually have a column running directly between the audience in some parts and the stage. Yeah. And so
I just did a project with Pro Arts
that's one of the theaters
months ago where I was doing some projection and had to avoid poles.
Yep. That's something we've done a lot of work with Pro Arts. Kudos to them. They're still going strong right now and trying to make a lot of community art and community performance happen in whatever capacity is available. So when you put this together, did you have a concept in mind for the distance and the angle of projection, or did you kind of set it up and then figure out where you're going to put things?
Yeah, it was definitely, part of the genesis of this is that I had gotten a grant from Artist Trust in Seattle to kind of prototype the dome. And then at the time I was planning on creating an internal projection device that used live water and some optics to fill it up. But then as I kept kind of playing around with some of the digital video footage that I had collected over the years, I started to think, wow, being inside of that is going to have this real amazing visual experience. And then from there it was, well, I don't have any digital video projection equipment, so let's write some grants and see what we can do for that. So we were able to get some funding through the University of Idaho in Moscow to get 2 projectors for their gallery, and we kind of picked out a couple that would work well for this concept of having 2 projectors on either side shooting the same footage at both sides, and then folding the images, kind of folding and fading into one another on the edges of the dome.
So 2 projectors total, or 2 projectors for each side?
2 projectors total, 1 on each side. Yeah,
got it. It's funny because it really does remind me a lot of, it's a similar concept for what we do in our planetarium shows. We'll use as many as 6 projectors, but they project across the dome to fill in and stitch together a full hemispherical image. And I've seen smaller, you can buy lenses for a projector that are hemispherical lenses that'll project, 180 degrees all around. And there's a lot of technology available, although not without, a significant price tag to make some of this happen. So
and that's where, I have been interested in, like, sort of trying to fill a project with the dream image in my mind, is really creating the context for some of this footage and for some of these things that I've done, and then seeing what it does to it, and letting the architecture of the dome drive the project, opposed to me imagining what I'm standing inside of the middle and trying to translate this dream world of mine to an experience for other people. It's more about being flexible to use what I have and create this dynamic experience.
Which I think has a lot of integrity, because as an artist, there's a lot of times you have to identify what your toolkit is, and without having too broad of a range of tools or too broad of a vocabulary, you have to kind of develop a theme and remain with that theme so that the work isn't all over the place and isn't distracting to audiences, but is basically saying, this is my single statement with this single work. I'm not trying to make it, say too much at one time. And I think that is in itself sort of a whole movement in that retrofuturism is here's a thing, here's a design, and it is what it is, and just go and experience it the way that I've created it.
Well, and for me, it's the process is as much part of the finished product as what my initial idea is, and it grows as the project is being completed. And I've always felt that I have to follow the work, that the work is its own entity. I'm a conduit for it, and these structures and these things that I'm able to create for it all work together to create something that wouldn't exist without me or without that process. And that informs me, and that gives me more inspiration for future projects. Oh, here's this thing that does that I wouldn't have thought of, but I happened across because I was open to the work talking to me instead of me just trying to dictate what that experience would be.
like a character in a novel. So you've basically created a scene, and you watch how your character might interact and how that character's personality would develop with your interaction.
Yeah, and then it takes on its own life, right? It takes on its own life from the genesis of that process. And that's more beautiful to me than maybe writing the perfect poem or drawing or painting the perfect picture. It's letting the picture draw itself or the poem write itself.
It's very musical in a way that Robert and I talk about sometimes, and I bring this up, I think, every podcast now, is when we talk about harmony in music, the way that different components interact, pitch components or textural instrumental components. A lot of writing music is a process of, we start with a theory, and then we let that theory develop in the context of the instruments, the ranges, and the philosophies we sort of assign as themes to the work. So whether we're talking about dissonance, consonance, harmony, interval, rhythm, or melody, or any other kind of musical vocabulary, a lot of it, we just have to try it all and force it into tight situations to see what comes out of it, to see what sticks and what doesn't work.
Yeah. And the composition tells you what works and what doesn't.
That's exactly what it is.
Force your will on it all the time.
Yeah.
Well, it's also the more generally speaking, there's aesthetic realism. Elie Siegel, he would say that creativity is the healthiest human process for the reasons we're discussing, that the more we put in from inside to some object or work or structure or composition outside, the more it will literally give back. And there's no other human process quite like that. So enlivening and healthy for the human spirit. And these days we're seeing a lot of creativity.
And that comes through as a viewer or a listener too. And you can really feel like something organically came together, and you can feel when something was kind of forced together. You go, oh, well, technically that was kind of put together nice, but maybe it doesn't feel like it has a soul as much or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Dive too far into existentialism here.
No, you're right. Where's the soul sometimes? It makes me think that maybe one of the strongest verbs that we have in our vocabulary is the verb to make, because we are in a position as human beings to be aware of the large scale end result as a concept, and try to reach for that. So to make something, other animals surely, make a habitat or a home or a nest for themselves, but we make something just for the sake of making something, totally independent of our own survival, almost as an exercise in existentialism to prove to ourselves we're still here. We can still do something. We can have an impact. And especially
as a visual artist, and I wonder if as musicians, you guys feel this similarly. It's that I understand my condition in my world and myself more through physical objects and more through the process of trying to create some of these environments for myself to experience, and then to see how other people react to it. That all informs my world much more than just thinking about it or writing or reading or any other process. And I think a lot of musicians think the same way, that through the compositions, through the music, they understand the world around them in a different way that they can't process in maybe more traditional ways.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, certainly.
What do you think, Andy, about sorry, Robert, I didn't mean to interrupt you. It sounded like you were going to say something.
No, go ahead, Peter.
Well, I wanted to see if we could take some of those ideas and relate them to some of the objects that you've built. I wanted to talk about and kind of listen to and look at not only your adapted phonographs, although I know that's not exactly what you call them, but that's, I don't know.
Fine. That works fine for me.
Yeah. So your adapted phonographs, and, from there, look into your light and projection devices, kind of getting back to what we talked about for the Luminous Soundscapes installation at Jack Straw. So why don't you pull up something and talk about it?
And also what was fascinating were your, the period of where you were using radios, old radios.
Yeah, let me go ahead and pull up some of those. And I think I have 10 ready to kind of look at. I can start you from the first to the last, or the most recent, as it were. Give me 1 second. I'll get to sharing this.
And I wanted to mention too, using, for example, a star chart as sort of a source material, very, very much like the work of John Cage and Christian Wolff, who we talked about in last week's podcast, where they sort of determine a method by which chance or random information is presented, and that's interpreted as part of the compositional structure.
Yeah, and some of those, as we'll see, that's some of the idea. Here's this set of information, and here's the parameters for which they'll be played, whether it be speed or tones, and hit play and see what happens. Instead of trying to assign meaning to each or tone or sound to each individual piece of information, just setting up the parameters and hitting play and seeing what happens. I should be sharing now something that says Radio Falls.
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. So it's all started with these old radio cabinets from the 1930s and 40s, and thinking about how I could embed some of these ideas into them. So here you'll see a video panel of a waterfall, and of course it, to me, sonically is the same sound as the hiss of an empty AM radio station. And so then I embedded this oscilloscope into the old dial. And so we get to see what the sound looks like and create this world where the sounds are the same, or where the man-made sound or the organic sound, natural sounds maybe overlap in this world.
And that's an actual oscilloscope in there.
Yeah, live playing the sound through the video file.
I learned recently there is an entire type of music that is all about creating shapes in an oscilloscope beyond sound waves, but actually three-dimensional shapes.
Oh, cool.
And I found a subreddit that's all about oscilloscope music, and this is new to me. But
no, I would love to dive into some of them.
Also, what occurred to me with the radio is Cage's, what's it called, radio music?
Yeah.
So where people would be dialing a number of radios at the same time. Yeah, I actually am prototyping a laser piano roll project where each hole in a piano roll would be attached to a radio tuned to a specific station, and then as the roll turns and the laser shoots through, it would shoot through each one and create a composition based off of
Cage's
radios. And so then I
that's a great
started
idea.
collecting all of these old radios and refinishing them and trying to imagine how the form of them could be used to think about the look of sound or the sound of light. And the next in this series is called Cyclonophone. And what you see is a laboratory flask that has a special magnetic stirring device stirring water into this cyclone in the middle where the old record player had been. And then these lights shine through the cyclone and into a light reading sensor to change the tone and imagine what the cyclone of light would sound like. And that's the sound that you'll hear when I...
So you're using like a photo resistor type of
exactly.
component?
Yeah. For all intents and purposes, and that's just taking an electric signal and bending it with the light and shadow to make that.
Makes me think also that with your piano roll laser work, you could develop kind of a similar thing, maybe an alternate performance of it where the lasers are shining through onto resistors or lights are shining through or something. You create a whole bank of, like optical theremin. Oh yeah, sorry. Let's hear that.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, there we go.
So what a gorgeous sound that is. And it's a lot more than just a photoresistor, obviously. Do you have some kind of a, is it some kind of a white noise? Is there some kind of filter, or how did you do that?
Yeah, it's actually just a light to frequency converter. And so it senses the light, but then just changes the frequency output. So it's just a constant electrical signal that then was varied by that translator.
So is that like part of is that like a Raspberry Pi component or something like that you?
No, this was a simple integrated circuit using a 555 timer not to get too.
No, I get it. I've built stuff with
cool.
I built a something with a 555 timer one time. I can't remember what it was that I built, but I'm familiar with the idea.
So all of these works started with, I've done some electrical work over the years, but never any electronic. And so each project was really this diving into a new world and trying to learn all these different things. And so a simple Google search of how would I translate light into sound led me down a rabbit hole to where I found this weird little sensor that I'm not even sure what devices it goes inside of, but it's called a light to frequency translator, and then ordering a couple from China and following a couple online tutorials to see what can I do with this thing and how does this work, and from there the work grew into this cabinet and into this radio. And so I really started with the basis of not knowing, say, what a 555 timer was, or even what a resistor or anything was, to then slowly build some of these projects. And that led into using the same, basically the same components to listen to dripping water instead of swirling water. And so this is inside of an old phonograph, and water drips in the middle. The light shines up to this meter here, which can be moved around the surface by whoever is moving the object, and change it bends the sound. For each one, I try to think of the utility of the performing utility of the cabinet itself, and kind of echo a lot of what the former uses were for, and see how that comes together as a composition.
So it really takes the idea of a dripping faucet keeping you up at night to a whole new interdimensional.
Yeah, and this was actually born out of a larger room installation that I had built, a 12 by 12 cube that water dripped from the ceiling into a box, and light shone up from below and filled the room with the shadows of the rippling water.
You demonstrated that in a TED Talk, didn't you?
Yeah, I think I did. Yeah, I was fortunate to be invited to do a TEDx talk.
TEDx, yep.
Back in when I was living in Yakima, Washington. And then I started to be able to build some more digital video into some of these. And so this is me combining two video files that were recorded simultaneously, one looking down at the surface of the water from above, and the other with a camera from below looking up. And then taking those two sound files as well and overlapping them onto one another, and thinking about the same place from different perspectives. Of course, the lower speaker area of these old cabinets would have had a very ornate fabric pattern over them. So I recreated a period fabric with the two footages as this fabric overlaid on one another.
Like an aquatic paisley.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Only much cooler, though.
Much cooler. A lot more psychedelic than I think it was meant to in 1938.
Yeah, they may have been a bit more conservative back then. Although it's amazing because not only does your work demonstrate this sense of reflecting the natural world and also kind of recontextualizing the experiences of it, but also the actual craftsmanship of these devices, to me is really astounding. I mean, when you say refinishing some of these I mean, it's essentially like furniture, but that's a whole, you're not giving yourself enough credit. Refinishing, they look stunning the way that you've presented them.
Thank you very much. It's, my background is in sculpture. I have my Master of Fine Arts in sculpture. And so I think I'm very comfortable with creating a beautiful object. But then from there, you have this beautiful object, and what can it be from there? And so that's what's always kind of driven my work. And so I overlook the beauty of them sometimes and get a little caught up in I didn't know how to do this, and then I was able to figure out how to make this thing work, and that gets me excited in a different way.
Well, you must have been inspired at first, so because you would see the object and you'd have to say, this is something I want to somehow celebrate and enhance. It starts with the form. It's a manufactured form that you take to a level well beyond its original intention. So it's kind of, one of the ideas of a sculpturist or a builder or a maker would be to take some materials and say, what can I imagine is possible with these materials? And then also reaching into, combining technologies, whether it's video or electronics, into making a whole new work out of something, repurposing it. It's very interesting.
I used to primarily be a bronze caster and cast objects into bronze. And what I would usually do is find natural branches and things that I found really interesting and think about how I wanted to turn them into these permanent beings in metal that would last forever. Well, I'd cast them, and then I wouldn't necessarily have a final form for them. And so they would just sit on the shelf, sometimes for years, until the idea for what they should be a part of would happen. And that's what ended up happening with all these radios, is that I just kind of got a little obsessed with collecting these broken old radios at old estate sales and things like that, and putting them up on these shelves and just slowly letting them talk to me and tell me what they needed. And this is a good example of one of those. This is, I ended up combining this cathedral style tabletop 1920s radio with a very low frequency radio receiver, which is something that is used by scientists to measure the electrical fields in the stratosphere. And they're particularly charged at sunrise and sunset. And so I video recorded a sunset, and then you'll hear the hiss and crackle of what sounds like the radio, but is these radio frequencies during the sunset. So these are frequencies that aren't man-created, that aren't created by humanity, that are existing in the universe, that we just happen to have come across a device that lets us hear them. So thinking about listening to the sunset.
I love that. Are you familiar with the NASA Voyager recordings, or have you ever come across some of those things?
Yeah, I have, and so they do, as I remember them, they kind of recorded the sounds of passing by Saturn and Jupiter and things, but then they were basically inaudible during their raw form, but then compressed in time to create these musical compositions. Is that right?
Yeah, it was definitely had some human influence. From what I understand, it was just huge data sets of the electromagnetic fluctuations of the atmospheres of these planets that they would basically map to be, audio. And they would create sort of like a waveform to represent certain things, and they would just create these structures for it. So it was definitely meant to be appealing, but I think it's essentially kind of a similar concept to what you were doing there, or at least maybe a similar data set that informs that,
No, and it is. It's fascinating to me to think about how limited our scope of understanding is with our biology. Our biology tells us how we can experience the universe. And at one point, I think I was watching the Nova on PBS or something like that, and they were talking about light and the full spectrum of light. If you drew a line from New York City to Los Angeles, and that represented the spectrum of light as we understand it to exist. The visual spectrum would be a dime on that line. So the vast majority of the information of the universe is unexperienced. We cannot experience, right, with our biology, that we have to create these devices to help us understand it and try and prove that it exists the way that we think it does with math. And so that's something that's really informed a lot of this work, this idea of there's all of this information in the universe, and we're so very limited by our biology. And what if we just took a moment to switch our experience of the world from the light that we see to the light that we hear, and the sound that we hear to the sound that we see, and make that simple switch and try to imagine what we might understand more of our existence if we weren't so bound by the limitations of our biology. This is using another one of those light frequency devices to imagine what a picture would look like. So the device is placed at the focal point of the pinhole of this little camera, this little box camera. So when I point it at myself, I get a sense of single tone of my selfie. What do I sound like as a single dot?
You know, I realize now as I see that work, I know that you know my friend Gwen Arkin, who's a camera enthusiast, and she was one of my photography mentors.
Yeah.
I wonder if Gwen has seen this work. Have you ever shown this to her?
You know, I haven't, so I don't know if she's stumbled across it or not. I hadn't thought about it when we were talking about we both are making projects for an upcoming exhibition at the Honolulu Museum of Art, and so we got talking about those projects, but that have little to do with this work, but we have got to know each other a little bit through that project.
She's an enthusiast for pinhole cameras and alternative process and chemograms.
Yeah,
and all kinds
she's
of great
working on this
photography.
beautiful cyanotype installation for that, and I can't wait to see what comes about from it.
So that's part of you and she were each commissioned for the Honolulu Museum of Art. That's for a work that has not yet been exhibited?
Has not yet been exhibited. It was we were slated to open the show in September, but it's now been pushed back to sometime in 2021 because of the uncertainty of the corona.
Is the work completed?
Which I think is good. I'll be interested to see how there are 20 artist projects in the show, and we were all tasked with addressing burning issues in Hawaii throughout the state, and how quickly our concept of what a burning issue in the state of Hawaii maybe has changed. And so I wonder how it's going to inform the finished product of everybody's work in a year.
It makes me think that all the artists who are a part of that show might just be like, whoa, hold on a second, let's start over, because now there's this whole other thing that's happening.
I know. And I'd be happy to share some of the draft work of that later on.
Sure, yeah, we'll talk about that
earlier
again.
about the Star Chart series, and this is the first of the Star Chart series. This is called Astrotone. And I basically created a music box out of this old suitcase record player. So I think it at first sounds a little bit like pulling a rake across a chalkboard, but then you start to hear the patterns, and something beautiful comes out of it. This is one of those ideas of, here's the objects, here's the things. I don't know what it's going to sound like, but I don't want to be in control of that. I don't want to curate the finished sound of it. I just want to set up the parameters and hit play and let that be what that is.
Well, where did you get those music box tines from? Were those from, did you just kind of pull those out of music boxes, or?
Yeah, out of some $2 music boxes. And so the star chart is at the 45th parallel, and every visible star on a completely dark night. So I think there ends up being some 800 points or something like that that make up the chart. And so then I got to start to refine some of these ideas, making these kind of synthesizers. Brightest of stars in the sky instead of all the ones that might be seen in the perfect conditions.
Pause the playback. Explain again what you were saying. I'm not sure if I could hear you real well over the
Sure.
the sound, but I want to hear you explain it again with this recent synth.
Yeah, so this becomes more like a scale from left to right, more like a electronic synthesizer piano type instrument, and I curated the star chart a little bit to make it so it was only the brightest of stars and have fewer touch points, so that it just had a different sonic experience.
And the sound is being created by electronics, and it sounds like it's.
Yeah, again, this is a 5/5 timer with a set of resistors that increase in resistance from left to right.
Got it. Okay, fantastic. I mean, I
have
no idea, but I think I get it.
Yeah, no, it's as basic of electric synthesizer as like maybe the sound from an Atari.
So it's creating kind of like a square wave, because the 5/5/5 timer would create like a pulse wave, and then so you're controlling the frequency based on the resistance from these different nodes on the star chart. I'm sorry, not nodes, but the placement of it, and
yeah, exactly. Then you're able to adjust the tone with the center dial there, and increase the pitch up and down. And that led into
rate of speed. Oh, there you go.
Yeah, and this led into this. This ended up being me taking apart a toy drum machine, and instead of thinking of it as a piano scale, trying to think about it as actuators for a drum machine. And so it's this toy drum machine, and as the star chart turns, it hits different paddles and creates the
I like how it says use the interface to add popular sounds, like a record scratch.
And this one is definitely, having more fun with the format.
I feel like I used to have that Casio keyboard, that all these sounds are so familiar to me.
And then it becomes a different experiential being for whoever's in front of it, because you actually get to play it, right? And you get to interact with the rhythm and the beat, and then add these different things into it. And it is a little bit more tongue in cheek, and but does kind of push how we think about rhythm, how we think about the information of the universe, and what it can be. It doesn't all have to be so serious. This one's more for fun.
Well, and the coolest part about it is, aside from it being a lot of fun, is it's interactive for its audiences too. So as musicians and composers, we often look for ways to be interactive with our audiences and to try to bring them into the composition, either by having them express a movement or express a sound or cue them to do things or ask for their feedback. This allows an audience to interact in a personal way, to explore the work in any way they want, based on their understanding and what they want to hear.
Yeah, instead of just see it and watch it and hear it, you get to participate, right? And that's a powerful experience.
I mean, I really want to kind of play with it right now. I'm looking at all the different labels, and you've got the cha-cha and the samba, as well as the rap and the hip hop. And I'm like, I wonder how all those things sound. It's a lot of fun, that concept. And I think that because it's fun, it's really approachable and accessible for a huge variety of audiences. Even if they don't understand what's happening, at least they feel like they're having some influence on what they're hearing.
This reminds me, Peter, a little bit of what Igor Santos did in some cases as a composer, where he followed a concept or a school called defamiliarization. Right. Have you run it across that, Andy? That's
no.
Where like a phonograph record that we kind of anticipate will do certain things, but ends up doing things not at all what we anticipate, and thereby we get to perhaps have a broader sense of what's possible from a phonograph record player, but placing whatever it may be, a keyboard, piano keyboard, into situations where we're getting sounds that we really hadn't associated with these instruments before. And then it was originally apparently more of a language concept of placing words and segments of poetry and et cetera in contexts that were not familiar, and thereby giving the medium new meaning. So the other thing is that these strike me as very, very apropos to our music of the spheres, with the stars laid out in your discs, and where we might, and we don't want to negotiate in anything here now because we've really just met you, but where it might be that we can apply the star-like objects that you've created to be projected on a dome, for example, and then the sounds that you are able to generate played back on the powerful sound system in a planetarium. The other thing is that our music of the spheres takes the opposite tack mostly, that we start with a selected piece of electronic, an already set piece of electronic music, and then asked the planetarium director, for example, to choreograph the sound with in-house effects. And then beyond that, things like Peter has done several pieces Peter's capable of creating his own full dome film that matches or responds to the music. So it's a little bit opposite process. And it's also fairly unique to any planetarium shows that we generally see, where we had been to the Imaloa Planetarium. Did you ever experience that, Andy, the Imaloa?
No, I haven't. But
okay.
I have been to planetariums.
All over?
Yeah.
So in the Imaloa, which is one of the first 3D planetariums in the world, we've had shows, and the connection of the music just melds into the visual effects. So it's a little bit opposite of that is, we started with the notion that electronic music as a medium, very fascinating, some great pieces, starting with Varese, Poème électronique. They're interesting to hear, but in a concert hall setting, it was deadening for us, some of us, to have just a couple of speakers on the stage. And you may have speakers
right, because there's not much to look at.
Yeah.
There's just the sound to hear, and it's pretty overwhelming. You know, I mean, I guess it all depends on how loud it is.
So what was an exciting environment in which to put this electronic music, and that led to the idea of using Planetarium.
Yeah, using the dome and fully immersing people in the sound and the visual, right?
Yeah,
and in a way, Robert,
totally immersive.
It reminds me
of a fusion of art and science, as you do, Andy. Yeah,
it's like the World Fairs when we were talking about Edgar Varese and Poème Électronique. So that was at the 1958 Brussels World Fair, and that was designed with Xenakis helped to design the environment for that. But that wasn't the only World Fair that had an electronic music and sculptural installation. So I think it was some years later, Pepsi funded David Tudor with an ensemble of sculpture artists to create this sort of living, breathing installation at the World's Fair. I'd have to pull out the article from the engineering magazine I was looking at, but they created basically a huge dome with projection, and they created their own fog environment. And then David Tudor created the electronic music soundtrack, and Pepsi was very disappointed because they didn't find it to be commercially viable at all for them. And they funded it, to the tune of like $2 million. But the World Fair is sort of like a means to create these massive works that are wholly unique and can be experienced no other way. It's like we're all kind of reaching, we want to create our own environment in which we can control the elements and the experience for the audiences. And in a way, it is like defamiliarization, Robert, a lot of ways, where we are removing familiar concepts from the context in which they would naturally exist, especially in the sense of an environment or a star chart or even a drum machine on a keyboard. And we're saying, well, what if it was this instead? And how would we discover this this device?
Well, and that takes me to the last of this series. Which is I call the Mystical Rose, but it's another phonograph. But I had come across at an estate sale this 10-inch disc replica of the rose window of the Cathedral of Notre Dame.
Wow.
And immediately thought it was like, I looked at it and went, that's the size of a 78. That's crazy. I got to figure out a way to listen to this thing. And so I was this is where I first get into some Arduino technologies and a sensor that reads color and assigns a note to different colors. And so I'll just try and hit play here. This one is similarly interactive, where there's a dial for the viewer or the listener to speed up the record, or you can also move the what would have been the needle across to kind of mix up your own sound.
I was going to ask about that specifically. So otherwise, is there some mechanism by which the light needle would move inwards as it progresses, or
no? It ended up being static. As I thought about how people were going to want to interact with it, I thought that it was going to be maybe more appropriate to keep people touching it and interacting with it if it wasn't if it was kind of static but able to swivel to wherever somebody wanted to bring it. What does the center sound like, and what is the black? Was no sound at all. So as the framework of the mirror would be played over, that's where you'd have these gaps in sound. You could play with the syncopation that way.
Right. It becomes a rhythm.
Yeah. X's on the blue area, and you can kind of start to see those patterns in the color.
It's a nice feature that there's a little light that lights up showing what light is being played at that time too, just for an extra level of experience.
Yeah, and you know, it's not like a theremin where the color is bending a tone. It's that colors set at a specific time frame will get played, so that it's not going woo, you know, stepping every microsecond, whatever timing that I had set up for.
So it's like a sample and hold.
Yeah, but the little light indicator will show you all of the in-between colors too.
Oh, wow, okay.
Does that make sense? So that's sort of bending in real time, but just, you know, every fraction of a second, it'll choose that color and play that color, and then the next. It
reminds me when I used to use the old analog modular synthesizers where you can plug in different voltage control devices. So there was one of the modules that was a sample and hold where you could effectively make it resample either noise or whatever sound source at set intervals or set the intervals to be random. So this reminds me of sort of a random controlled sample and hold of like a noise spectrum or something as well. Is that kind of maybe one way to consider it?
Yeah, you know, I'm just going to knock some things over
just
here.
Just making more music over there. It's okay. Creating sound.
No, you know, for me, in the programming, I discovered this kind of synthetic organ sound, which just seemed apropos for the church hall. So I started to think about myself sitting at that organ, not being able to play it, but just, you know, sort of typing with two fingers. Yeah. And what that would sound like, you know, of me playing around with the organ in the cathedral.
Yeah, you don't want to play with organs in
windows. That window is still intact, isn't it? After
I
the
believe,
fire?
it survived the fire.
Yeah.
Amazingly so. And this piece happened a couple years before the fire.
And it's played on a Victrola. What year do you expect that was made? I mean, that looks like it was a 1920s kind of a thing, or?
Yeah, I think it was a 1914. So.
Wow.
Yeah, and you know, the cabinet was in really good. Well, it was in pretty good shape, but the guts were gone, and I actually pieced together. The arm is from a second Victrola whose cabinet was destroyed, but the arm was still intact, and I was able to kind of piece together. And I had three Victrolas in different stages of demise that all were able to kind of piece back together to create a whole one.
Well, that brings me to another area you've explored, and maybe some of your first work, but where the installation is designed to deteriorate during the time of its exhibition.
Yeah, so that takes us back a long way. When I was finishing up my Master of Fine Arts in 2000, in the early aughts, as it were, in 2003, I had started to move away from the permanence of bronze cast objects and into these kind of ephemeral spaces that would deteriorate. And so I'd create architectural spaces that the visitor could enter into, and then slowly introduce water and heat and time to these compositions and watch the architecture slowly kind of fade away, and imagine, kind of what that all was like.
And did it have anything to do, and may be totally unrelated to this notion of wabi-sabi, that the beauty of the tear?
Yeah, that, you know, wabi-sabi, for those tuning in at home, it's a Japanese concept that there's more beauty in the imperfections of an object than the perfect object. That things are more perfect through their imperfections, I think. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah.
All right. Let me see if I can find a video to share with you for a minute of one of those. I hadn't Hadn't had one ready to go.
That's okay. So some of the material that you're using for those works, it looks like some of it you constructed out of natural dirt. It says water and red mountain dirt from Birmingham, Alabama was a work from.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, if you want to share what
on.
you're looking at, if you can, and
let me put it up.
We can talk about it.
So, and this is from your website, andybehrle.com, which is a very fun resource to explore. Started from the top of the Earth, Water, and Time.
Yeah,
page.
if you wanted to scroll down to the bottom, that kind of starts it all. Well, yeah. So the first work that I did I created a full 20-foot square building inside of a gallery that was coated with mud, similar to this Red Mountain wall that we're looking at now. And water slowly drips down the wall and starts to deteriorate the texture of it. But I got really interested in at this point I was living in Birmingham, Alabama, and I got more and more interested in how I could think about the place and time that I was and that some of these projects existed in. And so like here, if you stop on this Tomorrow's Relics, which is up just a little bit,
there.
I've taken two different mud materials from different natural environments in Alabama that have different significance. So the red that's underneath that beautiful tan there, that's from Red Mountain in Birmingham, which speaks to both the human and geologic histories of the place. Birmingham is a post-Civil War city and was built as basically the Pittsburgh of the South. It was built upon the production of iron, all because this one mountain, Red Mountain, had this vast deposit of all the ingredients that you need to make iron. And on top of that, I plastered the mud of creeks that are a little north of Birmingham that would have been stronghold areas for large Native American Creek Indian populations, and they of course have this really rich tradition of pottery. And so I was really interested in how I could take those historic human and geologic histories and put them on top of each other in sort of a modern architecture and see how they deteriorate together and then pile up the debris on the steel floor and rust back away the man-made material of steel over time.
It's a very musical composition in a way. I mean, I relate to everything, with music, largely. But what we're doing is you, in my understanding, is there are layers of meaning. And in Hawaii, a place will be named, and the name will inform some of the history and cultural significance of that place. And so in Hawaii, we call it the kauna, which are the layers of meaning embedded into the importance or significance of a place. So you have the kauna of Earth from this specific geographic location in terms of modern and historical cultures represented through sort of a degradation and a transformation that occurs, and it's all a natural process. Very interesting to me.
And then how we tend to not think about the product of humanity as being part of this natural process and succumbing to it, and then it all coming back to its formation, right?
I mean, I guess it will eventually, absolutely. I mean, in some way or another, whether we're still all here, as a result of climate change and, a million years, but the Earth will find a way to take itself back, I'm sure.
Yeah. And so, a lot of these projects were different ways of thinking about that. Scroll back up to the top would have been the last of that series, and I haven't had an opportunity to continue the series yet. This one was set up as a tomb in New Orleans. New Orleans has very few in-the-ground graveyards because the water table is so shallow, and so you can't actually keep a casket in the ground for very long. So for human history or Western human history, they've been building these tomb cities, which are really these magnificent places and these mausoleums. And so I wanted to bring this earth, water, and time to outside of the gallery setting, and was able to work with this historic house in New Orleans, where I stole from the architecture of the main building and built the false tomb of the original owners of the house. And what we did was I worked with the garden staff, because I am not a gardener, and they helped me choose plants that would be indigenous to the property. And then we let it go. We planted it and we did nothing to it, and waited to see what happened. And it was about seeing what invasive species would take over. And it turned out that only 3 of the indigenous species to the area survived, and the roof of it grew a grass that wasn't known by the staff to grow within 5 miles of the property.
Oh, wow.
And so
I was
it was
wondering
like,
about that roof, actually. I noticed that first.
Yeah, so we decided to put an earth roof on it and they planted a traditional garden, vegetable garden on the top. And this over the course of a year, the vegetable garden was replaced by this invasive wild grass.
Oh, wow.
It's wonderful work. Excuse me for a second. Could you carry on, please, without me, just for a few minutes?
Sure, absolutely. The exploration of how time and natural processes affect the sculpture is a very interesting theme. I've seen some sculptures.
It's similar into some of the musical contraptions, where I'm setting up I'm setting it up to let it go and become its own thing, right? Like I set the parameters and then I hit play, and then it takes on its own life afterwards. And
it's like the very root of experimental music is you design the process by which to experiment, and then the result is what the audience would hear or the composition. But it's all about the process of design.
Yeah, and you might have some sense as to what the outcome might skew towards, but being open to letting the work determine itself.
And it could be any process. I mean, you could create something and then light it on fire and let it all fall apart too. And all that is a means to make a statement about how fleeting each moment is, in a sense, or the transition that we experience in life, or the transitions that we are experiencing now in this crisis too, is that as we get from point A to point B, the environment around us is changing, and it's well out of our control. It's sort of a mantra for a lot of people, I think, who were panicked during this crisis a couple months ago, is they had a little bubble which represented all the things they control, but then yet this entire world existed outside of that bubble.
Yeah.
And they were at the mercy of everything else out there, and all they could do was control what was inside. A lot of people, everybody's getting haircuts and changing their styles during this time too. And now that I'm starting to see people again, I'm like, oh wow, you've all really changed so much behind the scenes,
Yeah.
Maybe we can go back. We could either talk about, we'll probably start to wrap this up soon. And we could either talk about your experiences with light, using your light synesthesia that we began the conversation with, or we can talk about kind of what's next and what you're working on now, what the future might hold, and what you're looking forward to.
Yeah.
If I may also suggest
Sure.
that studying some of your comments over on your website and your focus on water, it occurred to me a couple of things. That have you ever seen the film Synecdoche?
No.
Charles Kaufman.
No, but
Charles Kaufman.
Yeah,
But
no, it has been on my to watch list for quite a while. So I was just scrolling through. I'm sure everybody's Netflix and Hulu's are all getting a little thin, and I was like, oh yeah, there's that. I've been wanting to watch that for like 10 years.
Yeah, yeah. But it's a fascinating, amazing film, and it's about this concept, of synecdoche is the intimation of something much greater, the shortening, let's say, of a phrase. Say just COVID would be the shortening of the coronavirus epidemic, so on. But this artist decides to build a whole world within our world, and many layered reality that he establishes, which is this microcosm of the rest of the world. And you talk. That's why it triggered for me this notion that you talk about your work as kind of reducing water in one of your pieces as a reflection of water generally, the importance of water. And of course we get to the aspects of the indigenous people trying to save their water. Water is life. The whole what was it, the protests around the building of the pipeline, the access pipeline, and so on. And here in Hawaii, of course,
of course, it's such a pressing issue of security, right?
Yeah, but in general, that your work seems to be creating these microcosms that have tentacles out to the general subject of your work.
Well, and in different aspects of the work, and these different bodies are kind of looking into different aspects of it, right? Some are the life-giving properties of water, some are the destructive properties of water, or the movement of water as an analogy for us to understand the electronic world that we're swimming in and don't think much of. And just kind of started off the conversation talking about how I like to follow the work. And so I think that I've just followed the thought process of what is water, what is the physical experience of it to us. It's truly this keystone to environmental and ecological systems, but it goes beyond that too. And it goes into the spiritual world, I tried to look at different aspects of it from different angles and through different materials and different meanings, and just kind of follow it and see where it takes me, and then see where it drives the work.
Why does that remind me of Siddhartha? Isn't there a moment in the book Siddhartha by Hermann Hesse where a river exists both at the source and at the end at the same time? And somehow, I can't remember exactly, I'd have to read it again, but that is a metaphor for time in some way, that a river exists as one single entity, yet represents an infinite amount of time.
Yeah. I like that. We have to find that.
I'll post it somewhere, and we'll look at it later. It's been about 20 years since I read that book, but somehow.
Do you have a sample of Aurora Aquatic Corona?
I have something ready that was the first of those projects where I was projecting digital video footage onto inflated weather balloons. I'm gonna get ready to share one of the later projects here, which so you were talking about the a single balloon that was filled with video footage. And for this project, I had a gallery that I filled with 5 with video footage from around the Pacific Northwest. This was at Pacific University in Oregon. And so I wanted to piece together all these microcosms to put together a more interplanetary system of water sources.
So with all these spheres these are weather balloons, and they're
inflated to about 8 feet.
8 feet.
Diameter.
Thanks. And the projections are coming from somewhere above, or
across mostly, sort of above and across, and so they just hit one hemisphere, and then they glow the back side. So here that orange. Yeah, orange is glowing through from the other side, but we don't see the image, the resolution of the image from the front side.
No, so it sort of becomes blurred in a way that is in itself kind of a metaphor as well.
And thinking about the memories of those places and those moments in time fading from one side of the balloon to the other.
It also reminds me in your luminous soundscapes how there's some aspect of light, frequency, and color that are extrapolated from data, sort of like this. I think maybe there's some relationship there, but
I think that there is a relationship, maybe one that I hadn't fully intended, but your comments are sort of having me see that, which is really interesting.
In this case, the audience can interfere with the projections too, which adds another element of interactivity. Maybe, I'm sure that they would, it's like when we stand up in a movie theater and we get in everybody's way. So if I were in front of the projection, I'd probably, quickly jump out of the way. But in the same way that if the audience were to stay in the projection path, they would be recreating or making a unique experience in that art for themselves or for others.
And then when you're passing through it on your own and you're kind of navigating in between these worlds, then you're feeling full filled with the light. So let's take you to the luminous soundscape if I can. So this is returning to some of those analog. Am I showing the screen still?
Yes, you are. Yep.
Yes.
Some of those analog light through moving water devices, and the water is being activated by different sound files from field recordings that are also accompanied by some small video screens of those places and time. And so I'm just going to hit play, and you're going to hear sort of the soundscape of the city. And each color is a different footage. One thing that I was really interested in through the process of the field recordings is, I would point the microphone at the crows in the tree and really just want to hear them. And when in real time, I heard them. But the microphone hears everything else. It hears the background noise of the locks being filled. It is the traffic going by. And it's all of this information that our brains are able to kind of filter out so it doesn't go crazy with too much, trying to process all of the information of all those sounds. In real time, we're hearing maybe 4 or 5 of them, but the microphone hears all 100,000 of them. And then pieced together all 6 of those footages on top of each other, it just sounds like this roar, right? This hum, and little parts will come out. You'll hear a train horn here, or the crows over here, and it became much more about the information than I thought it was going to when I started the project, because I didn't understand that part of the process.
And yet, what you also accidentally did is I'm not sure if you're it seems like you are, but familiar with the idea of acoustic ecology, which is preserving the natural soundscape of an environment. And even if the natural soundscape involves the locks filling with water, that is still representative of a certain time when that is still possible, because in case someday that changes, that sound will no longer be available. If anything changes in our climate environment and the crows migrate north or something and we no longer hear them, that's another thing that you've preserved with this acoustic landscape, with this soundscape. And
there's a document now, right? And that's
yeah.
And that's how I've started to think of all this footage of all of these waters from all over different corners of the world that I've been fortunate enough to travel and do projects for. That I now have this catalog of these times and places, and been working on this new project for the Honolulu Museum of Art, and piecing together video footage from what hopefully will be from all 8 major islands. With travel restrictions, we'll see what happens in the next year with that. But I was combing through some of my footage and realizing I have this footage from the Puna district of the Big Island from 3 years ago, before the eruption, that is now land, where there was this beautiful seascape, and the edge of the world on the southeast corner of the island is now land, and how I have this memory of this, right? This frozen memory in this catalog. And really that's what each of these is this moment in this catalog of throughout time, and what's to become of that? What does that all mean? And how can I use that in future work?
Is sound important in this new work, this new commission?
No, we haven't dove too much into some of the digital video pattern work that I've done, recreating some quilt patterns and traditional kind of arts and craft patternry, and textiles and stained glass and things like that. What I'll be doing is recreating a historic flag quilt, Hawaiian flag quilt, using video footage of light reflecting off of water in different places from different islands, replacing the red fabric with the sunset off of Lahaina Bay, or the blue in the flag with the rushing waters of the Wailuku River, and so on and so forth. And in that work, I've been trying to discover the right way to integrate sound in, and haven't found it yet. So that's I think the future of some of that work, is trying to find the connection between the visual and a sonic experience.
And it looks like that Honolulu Museum exhibit is going to be, it's been postponed for until 2021. So that's when we can kind of expect to go over there and take a look at that.
Yeah. And I'd be happy to share a little kind of preview. I've been able to create one composition from Maui. And so, let me take you through that real quick.
Yeah, let's finish up soon with some of the patterns of light and water, and you can talk about it briefly, and that'll give us a chance to a cliffhanger until next time, until we have a chance to see some more of this work develop.
That sounds great. Here, I'm gonna go ahead, Peter, or Robert.
Do you have any? Do you have to get? Do you have some time restraints, Peter? Do you have to?
I have just sort of a job to get to, but I have about another 30 minutes or so at the most.
Yeah.
But
No, there were just a few other things that interested me very much that maybe we could discuss briefly.
We'll keep going. That's fine.
Okay.
Sure. So here's, I'm sharing now, I think.
Yes, you are.
This is the historic quilt. It's about 100-year-old quilt that's in the collection of the museum. And here you'll see it transform with the patterns of water from different places around Maui. So here it's just 4 sets of footage kind of spliced and pieced together to recreate that quilt, and think about systems of water and the interconnectivity between the waters Mako to Makai. So here.
And so how many sources of water were being demonstrated with that composition?
So here there are four. There's the,
Four,
you know,
you said,
the colors of the quilt, the red, the blue, the white, and then in the center you'll see a little golden.
Right, yeah.
In the seal there. And so, yeah, I have footage there from looking at sunset from Lahaina. Out at Hana is the blue, and the white is cascading water in the Wailuku River. And trying to piece together these, you know, the human and the geologic histories, and how they overlay with the human experience. You know, Lahaina means something different than it did 100 years ago, but the same spot in Hana by this formerly very important heiau is untouched, and the same that it would have been 500 years ago. And thinking about the layering of those textures, those colors, and those places to inform, you know, what it is that Hawaii is today and will be in the future.
Is that water footage from the heiau out near Kahanu Gardens, the Pi'ilani Hale heiau?
No, it's I would have to remember. No, it's further east. So if you could hike to it from Wainapanapa towards the east.
Oh, okay, fantastic. Yeah, there's a lot of beautiful places out in Hana that are very well preserved.
And so, and just thinking about how it hasn't been bulldozed, right? It hasn't been bulldozed and recreated, not just once, but maybe dozens of times, like sites in Lahaina have over the course of the last 300 years. And to think about it being frozen in time, and Lahaina, a spot in Lahaina being frozen in a much shorter time frame. Like, that's it today, where even though I shot that footage in Hana a couple months ago, that might be representative of 500 years ago, because although each moment is unique, they are only so unique from one another, right?
But yet they do change, though. They do change, whether by human interference or from a lava flow.
Oh, of course. And that, thinking about geologic time being the difference between geologic time for a project that I did in Tunisia and for one that I'm working on the Big Island is, millions of years of difference of thinking about of geologic time, right?
It's like the time that we experience within our lifetime as compared to the scale of time,
exactly.
Historically, it's like the band of light frequency that we can interpret versus the light frequency that is available.
That dime on the long line between New York and LA.
It's exactly the same, I think, scale wise.
Yeah. This is sort of building upon a series of works that kind of re-envision traditional patterns of textiles and of stained glass windows and even wallpapers and things like that, and thinking about overlaying moments in time and different places in time, and trying to get a holistic view of today through those histories.
Do you have footage from your Wailuku project in the cathedral?
Yeah, I do.
That's quite stunning, really, what you did there.
Thank you. I'll pull that up right now.
Was that, so that was in 2019 that was exhibited, and that was exhibited basically for one night only, is that right?
It was a one night only. So let me pull it up and then I can focus.
Part of our.
Sometimes I can multitask, but not always.
An Art Town project of the National Endowment for the Arts.
Yeah, so Small Town Big Arts was formed to write this grant for the NAA to get an NEA Art Town grant, and from it they are helping produce. I think it's 15 kind of site-specific temporary projects throughout Wailuku Town as revigoration project. And so I was fortunate enough to kick off the initiative as the first project, and I was driven by the stained glass window history through a Wailuku town and all the churches, and was doing a bunch of research and came across this beautiful Gothic cathedral that used to stand in Wailuku, but burned in arson in 1977. And so I became kind of obsessed with finding some photos of what did the stained glass windows look like in that. And I became this treasure hunt to try and find pictures and then color pictures of this cathedral. And I finally came across a couple photos that I was able to recreate one of the single windows that was lost in the fire. That church burned down, was knocked down completely a year later. There's been a new church built on its site for 35 years now. And so this is sort of my iteration of that stained glass window from the St. Anthony's Church that burned down in 1977, using all footage that I collected Malcolm Mackay in Wailuku from the Iao Valley out to the bay. And so it'll fade in and out. Didn't have good color photos, so I decided to take some artistic license and piece together a number of potential options of what they may have looked like.
Mm-hmm. The colors are gorgeous in that representation. To me, it actually, I realized that what you're representing with this work is, so we have this concept of ahupua'a, which is basically like a sustainable ecosystem that flows from Mauka to Mackay and represents, where different types of food or sustenance or materials are cultivated all the way from the mountain to the ocean. So this is water representative of the Iao Ahupua'a or however the area is named.
Yeah. And so then, just trying to fit, through black and white photos, I was able to distinguish which shades of gray would have been their own color, right? And then assigning, okay, that's gonna be red. That shade of gray is gonna be red. That shade is gonna be white. That's gonna be blue. And then have them each of the 5 compositions fade in and out of black and white, and then back to the next composition. And so we presented this as a site-specific video projection on the side of the Iao Theater during First Friday in September of 2019. And
how high is it?
So when it was projected there, it stood about 16 or 17 feet tall.
Oh wow!
Which was roughly what I was guessing the original windows were, based off of some pictures. It was really hard to find documentation of the original building. It had been built in 1917, I think. And finding much documentation was hard, mostly because the archives of the church was in the church that burned down. Oh,
that's unfortunate, but makes sense.
Yeah, what safer place could there be, right, than inside the church to store everything? And so it was one of those experiences presenting it that night that drives me to create work like this, where people that weren't expecting it and have never experienced digital video projection work just happened into it. And a number of people that went, that's the window of St. Anthony's Church. That's where I was baptized. That's where I was confirmed. That's where I was married. That's where we buried my parents. And you brought that memory back to me. You brought that place back to me. And they recognized it immediately and then wanted to share their stories. And that was the intent of the Small Town Big Art initiative. And it really was one of those moments of, this is where the work is communicating through itself to the audience, and then the audience back to me in this really beautiful, profound way.
Yes, awesome. It's an awesome work. Andy?
It's profound when a work can reach an audience where it reaches their memory and their sense of nostalgia. It's almost like how when we smell something, you know, a food, it'll bring us right back into that place where we've experienced that before. And also something I've experienced in the last couple of months in this lockdown is that I've had profound waves of nostalgia. And whether it's in, you know, my dreams or even in my waking life, just daydreaming, but how you can reach something that's deep within you that we've almost forgotten about. And I'm sure that these folks hadn't forgotten about the window of St. Anthony's Church, but that it brought them back in a new way to say, and here it is again, and here we have reimagined it, and it is a part of your life, and it's a part of our lives again.
Yeah, and really a part of the fabric of the history of the town, even though it's gone, and you know, kind of resurrecting it in that way. It just, I felt like it was an honor to be able to present this piece of history that, you know, it burned down before I was born, and before most of the people that saw it were even born. And how much longer is the memory of the place going to last? Especially given that I spent 4 months searching for photos and found 12. Right? Yeah. It's like, and so okay, here's this piece, and this lasts because this is digital format, right? And so this gives it some sort of lasting impression that is, you know, just driven by me filtering the history of the place where it was, and using these tools to reimagine it.
Yeah, a lot of what you've been talking about, there's so much, Andy, and we do have time limits here, but for example, is it interstitial spaces that you explore? That's well worth our viewers checking out on your website. And also, the question here is that one of the frustrations we've had, not frustration, but the sort of limits of music, of the spheres, as expressed in one instance by the director of the, not Imaloa, the Imaginarium in Kaneohe, Dr. Joseph Ciatti, was he said, you know, why can't we start with a visual and then have the music, and then back and forth? And so that actually occurred in one instance with the composer John Magnuson from Oahu, who worked with Joseph back and forth to create a piece. But this, it seems always we're somehow limited to the one way, either from the music to the imagery, or from the images to the music. That next step to go back and forth seems the most challenging. Have you ever approached a piece in that way, that you've created a sound from light, and then the sound somehow impacts the visual again?
Yeah. I'm certain that there's, you know, this constant give and take when I'm especially tinkering with those devices. It's like, oh, well, here's this, and you move and you make these adjustments based off of trying to find the right balance between the visual and the sound, right? And there's always some, you know, there's always a curating at the end of finalizing a project like that. But I have been lucky enough to use some of my video footage to compose video accompaniments to musical compositions, and I've been interested in trying to figure out how maybe some of the technologies that I use in the sound sculptures could be taken and combined with maybe some of these video projections. And, you know, here you have these sensors set up, say, on the dome or on a screen, and it's creating taking the red light from this part of the quilt or this part of the stained glass composition, and triggering some sort of either electric sound or using it as like a MIDI trigger to then you could start to kind of mix together like a DJ does, or the soundscape between this sound, that sound, and having them be triggers or having them be directly translating what you're seeing at the moment, and then how that might be played upon by live musicians too is really it's some of the more interesting kind of musical experiences that I've had were where I saw in Birmingham, Alabama, DJ Shadow live mixed the orchestra. So the orchestra would play and he would record it, and then he was live mixing back in as they were playing their past sounds and overlaying, and then both improvising with one another in this kind of neoclassical jazz like explosion. It was really this amazing experience. And I've seen it as well with some like solo, it seems to be becoming a little bit more popular, solo instrumentalists who are recording a back track and then playing that back live and playing another track over the top of it and layering and layering and layering, and how that might be an interesting way for the visual artist and the musicians to be playing off of one another somehow and being inspired by what they're seeing and filtering that through their music in live time, or how there are so many possibilities there, and what that looks like, what that sounds like is totally fascinating to me.
I like that kind of performance, that layered, additive, constructed performance where they're creating loops. And I've seen some musicians just start beatboxing and they're recording different samples and it's being looped, and then it suddenly becomes a whole song. And there's actually a guy locally who does that, Kanoa, and he's really good at that performance.
Is he a violinist?
No, he's a vocalist and guitar player. And
cool.
He does, I've seen him play weddings, I've seen him play hotels, I've seen him play solo concerts, and he does a lot with sampling himself and looping himself and building these really intricate, songs just off of loops that he creates either with his own beatboxing skill. He'll pick up a bass and put a bass line in there, he'll play guitar, and then he'll just start singing, and it just is gorgeous what he's doing and super fun to listen to.
No, and it's for, I think especially for casual listeners, it's really engaging, because I think that the people with a more attuned sense of music, like you both, you may be able to pull all those parts and pieces out of a composition, out of a song in your mind, and be able to see maybe even a whole orchestra playing each part, where a more casual listener gets to kind of, oh, that's that and that's that.
They can see it being built. They can see it in real time
together. Yeah, and that's a really powerful way for especially casual listeners to connect to the music.
Yeah, the notion from Cage, perhaps, and this is only my interpretation, that he kind of let go of his ego in second half of his career and allowed for the I Ching to determine his chance, or had his piece silence and just had the audience kind of interpret it entirely. And it strikes me, on the one hand, it is an irony that in a way it's grand egotism to say, well, whatever happens, and these are my rules, this is my game, and it's awesome. And it's just a little bit of the reverse of what, on the other hand, and more deeply maybe, Adam Tendler was pointing out, and this is my impression from your work as well, that there's a whole lot that goes into determining the process whereby you are willing to let go, of ego. So many of the intricacies you've described are, and as you've just indicated, that you're really calibrating things carefully before you let it go, so to speak, and allow it to be freely interpreted. So it's not just simply a matter of here's a splotch on a piece of paper, go with it, and to the musicians. It's much more than that usually.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in the best kind of work of that kind.
It's I think it's empowering to see myself as just the beginning of the work, and seeing and letting the work grow, and not limiting it by like what I wanted it to be. And I know plenty of artists that they have an image in their mind. This is what the work is going to be, and then that determines the end. And sometimes the hard part for me is determining the end. When is it that I get to the point where maybe it's not quite what I started out pursuing, but it became this thing, and that's the thing that I now say, here world, go with, or here process, keep going from here. At times I felt like I was the limiting factor to the work, or letting the work go is more informative to me than making sure that it ended up going on the smooth track to this beginning to end, and there it is, and it's this thing, the static thing.
The process is the world in which your character interacts. So you don't know your character, but you come to know your character by how they interact with the world. So you come to know your artwork by the processes that you deduce to create it in a way. It's almost like you have this poor thing that's unmolded, and you just keep throwing stuff at it until you find it's like uncovering the sculpture in the slab of marble.
Yeah, I very much so. That was, what Michelangelo is attributed to say, it is, I let the marble tell me what to do, right? And then and then David is revealed, right? Like, it's like, okay,
it was in there all along somewhere.
Yeah.
I just found this. It was just laying there,
just inside this block of rock, and it was there.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm going to regret having made that combination.
That's okay.
Are we getting back to the ego again?
No, but that's the amazing part. And that's what, with John Cage, it's you design the process, and the process has to be meticulously noted so that the work has integrity. Because you can't just tell a group of musicians, well, do whatever you want, and that's the composition. Here's a very strict set of rules, but you can follow these rules, and within those rules, play the game however you want. However you discover the end result is your process as well. And it's interactive, just the way that your sculptures, are largely interactive in their own ways too.
It's amazing to have such names bandied about in a conversation of my work.
Well, we're all a part of this thing. We're all in this, man. It's all this is the world of human existence. So.
Well, because in one interview you were asked who your influences are and so forth. And my recollection, you weren't that specific about any particular teacher or particular school of influence.
Yeah, I don't know, just the more that I've spoke about my work and thought about my work and my process, to me, I'm a holistic filter of my experience, and just be like, oh, well, James Turrell, of course there's light art in my work. There's sound in my work. There's found object. There's, Andy Goldsworthy-esque textures. Like, yeah, I see this. We relate to this. But by pointing out their names and their work, I fear that then that drives the perception of my work to these boxes. But really, it's this holistic filter of all of this, and I don't want to try and buoy up the importance of my work by saying, oh yeah, I mean, can't you hear John Cage here? That's intimidating to me, but also, I'm inspired by the work. I'm inspired by the offshoot of the work, right? And how popular culture has assimilated a lot of these things, and how can I separate a Tide commercial that looks like an Andy Goldsworthy from one another as being the influence on me, right? Like, which one did I see last?
I hereby formally, I withdraw all comparisons I've made in this show to anything that might have existed independent of you. I formally withdraw those.
You know what I mean?
No,
I mean, as these things seep into popular culture, I mean, like I said, like the Tide commercial or an Aquafina commercial or something like that, maybe had as much influence on the beginning of a process or a project for me as anything else. And I want to be upfront about that. Like, maybe a Super Bowl commercial got me or something and got me on this track, or like this moment in a Nova, or this amazing experience in front of artwork at the National Gallery or wherever it is. Like,
because it's all there. It's all there somewhere.
Points. Yeah, there are always these starting points, and for me to maybe want to attribute it to the one that sounds coolest or most profound, I don't know. I'm hesitant.
Well, I mean, luckily you have stumbled, I mean, for a long time now on your own independent voice, totally, separate from the works of any artist that we may have mentioned in the show so far. And it seems like it's just an audience's way of saying, that reminds me of this. So
totally.
It's a nice
way to be able to converse about it. Yeah, for sure.
Comparisons, though, can be born from hostility, even violence. So someone who said that, Krishnamurti.
I mean, I'll always take the ones rooted in praise. I'll take that. I don't mean to discredit that. But, as I'm talking about it from my side, that's a different way of me curating the viewer's experience, and really at the end of the day, I want the viewer to interact with the work and not so much with my story or my experience, but through the work. And that's what I always feel like is a successful project, is when somebody brings their story back to me through my work instead of me bringing my story to them.
Yeah.
Good point. And
very much like the St. Anthony Windows.
Musical experience of performer, composer, and listener. It's all three. It has to be a synergy there. You can't separate them. Morton Feldman, the composer, you said, well, there are certain pieces that are composer pieces, and there's certain pieces that are performer pieces, and there are other pieces that are listener pieces. That's too fragmented an interpretation. It really should be this, again, this synergistic combination. And end of a performance of mine, someone came up to me and said, that sounds a little like Messiaen, they said. And well, it may, but for me, it was coming from a totally other place. Of course, as the artist, the creator, one is very subjective and maybe is unable to interpret one's own work in a comprehensible way. But the notion, it sounds like this or it sounds like that, from that to me was coming a little bit from a point of comparison as subliminal hostility.
Well, it's easy from the creative perspective to think, well, that wasn't part of my process, or that was not directly like that. That came from me, man. Like that was.
I am my own.
It sounds like this, or it looks like that. Like, no, man, that was me. I'm
not a product of my interest in environment. No way.
But at the same time, if somebody's talking about a work that you just don't like, you're like, come on, man! Like,
never mention that to me again.
Yeah. What are you talking about?
But it's also
don't do that to my work.
But it could be also complimented. Well, okay, if a work sounds like, what did Billy Joel made a classical recording, and people said, well, that sounds a lot like Chopin. And I said, well, apparently said something like, well, that's, great if my work sounds
awesome. Thanks. Thanks, man.
Well, I tell students, kids who I work with, because I work with, middle schoolers and teenagers with photography and with media arts. I tell them, just keep making stuff. Even if you hate it, the stuff that you choose to show and the stuff you keep is representative of that style and that voice that you will eventually find. You just have to keep doing it, taking pictures, making videos, and the stuff that you like in the end is going to be the stuff that is most reflective of who you are as an artist.
Well, and sometimes you learn more from the stuff that you made that you don't like, and it helps steer you in different directions. And like, oh, well, that didn't turn out the way that I thought it was going to.
Well, they say it's a good way to get over like a writer's block is that if you are trying to make something and you can't get anywhere with it, just make it really terrible on purpose. And then at least it gives you something to correct or something to move away from. At least you've done something.
But Peter, you talked about discarding some composition you'd begun.
Yeah, I was working for the last few months on something and just threw it away. It's just how it goes sometimes.
And that happened to me recently, and it's kind of a freeing up,
it was like, I don't have to deal with this anymore.
Yeah.
I thought I really liked the idea back in January, and then all this stuff happened, and I'm like, well, I guess I'm in a different place with it, so let's just start over. Maybe there's an element of it I'll keep, but at the same time, it's okay to move on and to let go.
Or it'll be the appropriate finish to something that that has yet to be written, right? And that thing. And that's earlier about my shelf of stuff that was like, oh yeah, this has the potential as something. I have no idea what it is today. And maybe it's going to sit there for 10 years, and then it's going to tell me what it needs. And
actually, it's a reminder of how much your wife loves you that you have all that stuff on the shelf all the time. Dealing with 100-year-old Victrolas from city to city, I'm sure it's not all that fun.
You got another one?
Another 200-pound piece
just started to show up in front of my studio. I just drive up to the studio, and boom, there'd be an old radio there. Became the dumping ground.
Well, that's why your last name is Behrle, is because it takes a real man to handle all that old equipment. It's heavy stuff. It's machines and wood, and back in the day when they could make stuff. Well, gentlemen, I'd like to kind of start wrapping it up. So,
sure.
If we have any last thoughts or philosophies or ideas,
you're the engineer, Peter. It's up to you.
We're all the engineer now, Robert. We're all in this together. As I'm constantly reminded.
I'd like to say that I'm so thankful for the conversation. I throughout my life I've actually had more friends that are musicians than visual artists, and I think that the creative processes can be very similar, and we tend to put them in different categories and want to look at them through different spectrums, but really there's much more in common to the processes and to the filtering of the world into these artworks, and I've had a great time talking with you both.
Well, it's been wonderful to meet you, Andy, and we hope to work with you, particularly with the music of the spheres in the planetarium. But it feels like an installation of some kind somewhere that we determined would be another way to go. But and one other academic reference, the interaction of color. That's Joseph Albers, the Homage to the Square. You're familiar.
Yeah.
And so that was to me the moment where the connections you're talking about between music and art and visual really crystallized, where he so many times in that book he makes the analogy to music, to elements of music as compared to elements in color, that it really struck me as a very fertile ground. And like you say, we separate in our Western culture, we separate it. I made reference to this Ugandan composer that we met some years ago, and he told us they don't have a music department at in the capital Kampala, but wherever the university where he taught in Africa, they don't have separate departments of music, department of theater, department of visual art. It's all one. It's completely merged. So the crossing of disciplines is just a normal, natural thing. So depends on the culture, really, how we subdivide these art forms.
Well,
so
good.
those are my concluding remarks.
I wasn't sure if there's more. No, that's good. It's like we could just keep going a long time. So I hope we have a chance to do this again. And
well, hopefully
Andy,
next time in person would be nice. It'd be
very good.
Lovely to share space with other human beings, including yourselves.
Thank you very much. Look forward to staying in touch with your work, Andy, to seeing you on Maui. And do you have an expected sort of time frame of when you might try to return amidst this quarantine?
Yeah, we're hoping that we can get back to the islands in July. We'll see what happens with the quarantining and all of that to see what makes sense. We have a family and have to figure all that out. Getting back.
Yes, you do, sir. Well, keep it up in the meantime, and keep up the wonderful work, and keep us updated and abreast of your interests, your passions, and your explorations.
And thank you for introducing us to the really the wide breadth of areas you've explored as an artist. It's quite inspiring and very, very impressive. So we appreciate you joining us, and we hope to collaborate in the future.
I hope that the world presents us that opportunity.
All right. Thank you very much, Andy.
Take care, gentlemen.
See you soon. Take care of yourself.